on Richardson and Boyd, but I also posted 2 articles, and we're going to try and experiment. I'm going to split you guys up into groups to each read one of those 2 articles, several small groups, each reading one of those 2 articles, and work on a sort of questionnaire worksheet. So I'm going to start talking about evolutionary psych, and like I said, then in cultural evolution, we're going to try to do a bit of a semi-independent worksheet on the Nuer and the Dinka and the Yankee and Yeoman farmers. 2 examples. The Nuer and the Dinka get discussed by multiple folks. They were mentioned in the readings for tonight, and the Yankee and Yeoman farmers were mentioned by Richardson and Boyd. Okay, so evolutionary psychology is kind of like the 4th way of thinking about human behavior that we've been talking about, sort of sociobiology, behavioral ecology, evolutionary psych, comparative psych. Evolutionary psych and comparative psych are very, very different. Comparative psych is an American school that focused on general process learning. Think Skinner, associative learning, conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. Evolutionary psych is almost the opposite. It's basically a branch of psychology that frames most of our behavior as kind of hardwired adaptations from the past that no longer serve their current function. So evolutionary psych is kind of defined by a focus on evolved, innate psychological mechanisms. And so most of the evolutionary psych literature views current behavior as the legacy of shortcuts, tools that evolved that used to be helpful and now no longer are. So Cosmides and Tooby are husband and wife pair of faculty at I think UC Santa Barbara, and they've driven this movement a lot, and so their quote is, "Our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind." And you read lots of versions of this, right? Everything about, we should be trying to eat like we did in the Paleolithic to be healthier, sort of in some ways houses a grain of truth mixed in with a whole bunch of projection. So we'll be talking about that. Another concept that's really important, or sort of the way people talk about that current behavior as being maladaptive, but that's how we're hardwired, so that's how we're going to act, is this idea of an EEA, an environment of evolutionary adaptedness. So this is that Pleistocene savanna where our traits sort of functioned perfectly, and it's actually a subject of a great deal of controversy, whether or not there actually ever was an environment of evolutionary adaptedness. I'd argue that there is no such thing, and the arguments have caused evolutionary psychologists to change the definition, but not actually change their thinking, right? So I think I have a slide on it later, so I'm not going to write it out now, but the environment of evolutionary adaptedness used to be considered to be a single time when we were cavemen and perfectly adapted. Now it's presented as an amalgam or an average of past selected environments, but the take home's the same. Interestingly, there's a really productive research program that looks at cognitive ecology in among different animal species. That's, I would say, a lot more successful. So this is cognitive ecology, is the field that studies the cognitive abilities which are sometimes hard to measure because, lack of language and all that stuff. So it often involves things like spatial learning um, of different species, and asks whether and how the cognitive abilities and tools of different animals match the ecological challenges that they face. So within the American sort of comparative psych tradition, there used to be this idea that like learning is this general process and you can train anything to, respond to any animal, to respond to any stimulus. And in fact, um, that that wasn't true from the beginning, and then sort of failures um, to teach certain kinds to make certain kinds of associations led to a criticism. So I forget his first name. It's killing me. I've lost the power of speech. I'll pop up in the middle of the night. There was a comparative psychologist, blank Garcia, who found that you could use stomach upset to train rats to avoid certain foods. So you could take a food and make it a certain food that's normally palatable, and if you put, you know, different kinds of, um, you know, something like quinine, something in a low dose, something that would not be harmful to their health, but would give them stomach upset within a short time, like within a half hour, you can easily train rats to avoid food. Thank you, John Garcia. Thank you, Anupa. Um, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, actually, rats, similarly to humans, are omnivores. We have a wide diet, and it is highly adaptive to be able to learn from experience what foods are healthy or harmful. And it's the same things. It varies a lot among people, but you might have relatives who, um, you know, had a stomach flu, you know, which is usually not caused by flu, but some other bacteria or virus, but we call it that, that made us sick to our stomach. And it's like a well-known phenomena that many people avoid for a short or a long time whatever food they had before getting sick. So if it happened to be rice, you might avoid rice. If it was spaghetti, you might avoid spaghetti. And sometimes those aversions can last a really long time. Um, so that's interesting. But what he found was that he couldn't use stomach upset to train rats to avoid certain sounds or lights, right? Um, he could use electric shock to train another aversive stimulus to train rats to avoid sounds or lights, um, and that kind of makes sense. But it's interesting, right? That certain associations are easier to be made, and those are ones that match kind of the usual learning tasks that rats as omnivores face in their environment, stomach upset from food. But sounds or colors never cause stomach upset. They might be associated with like a tree falling or something like that. But those associations are much harder to train. So just this one example shows that animals may be hardwired to learn some tasks and not others. Um, and if you expand your range, there's a lot of learning that animals have that they don't need any reward in order to learn. So clearly, some animals are hardwired to learn some tasks already. But in any event, for comparative psych, it had to work through by trying to do the associative learning sort of paradigm in the lab and like failing consistently, repeatedly. Um, so this has expanded to look at cognitive differences among sometimes closely related species and how they match environmental challenges. So these are two corvids. Corvids are the crows and jays. And what you have on the left is Clark's nutcracker. And this is a species that it lives in desert, like high altitude, and they are fairly expert seed storers. And it's been estimated that they store 30,000 seeds in the summer and fall to recover through the winter. And these birds are good at recovering a high percentage of the seeds that they store, something like 70–80%. To the right is a scrub jay, closely related, also in the same family of birds, Corvidae. And these guys store seeds, but a lot less. So they store about 6,000. It's been estimated. And the nice thing is that you can use like some of the lab training tools, the development of, sort of rigorous repeatable trials to really drill down on sort of spatial learning abilities of different species. So this is an 8-arm radial maze. So there are some landmarks, but the landmarks are somewhat similar. And what you can do is you allow birds to store food within this arena, and then you hold them for a day, 2 days, whatever your experiment is going to be, maybe a week, and then you release them in the arena, usually without any seeds anywhere, and you see which ones they investigate first. So it might be, I don't know if it's easy or hard to see, there are like little cups with sand all around the room. And so the birds can't see whether a cup has a seed in it, but you can then see which ones they explore. And oh yeah, no, they're really good at it. The challenge, or the challenge in any of these experiments is like coming up with a task that's hard but not too hard, so you can see the variability among individuals and among species, right? Because on the one hand, these trials are almost always much shorter time than out there in nature and far fewer seeds, but they're also a simpler environment. However, out in nature, there's much richer like landmark cues, and also the birds have a lot more choice in how they hide, so they can do a lot of, I'm going to always hide in like this kind of spot for this kind of tree, and those can be shortcuts that don't necessarily rely on spatial memory. So it's interesting. You can find the lab setup that is a challenge but not too much of a challenge, and then you stick with that. And what they found was consistently the species that store more seeds, in this case nutcrackers and pinyon jays, store score higher and remember for longer. So these are the nutcrackers and pinyon jays are the more extreme seed storers. The scrub jay that I showed you before, remember the Clark's nutcracker is 30,000 seeds, Western scrub jay 6,000 seeds, and the scrub jays and Mexican jays are score consistently a little bit lower. They all have good spatial learning and spatial memory compared to bird species that don't store any seeds, but within this family, the ones that store more seeds also have better spatial memory. And the neural basis of seed caching has been studied, and so is somewhat understood. And one area that's, the homologous region in humans is very important for different kinds of learning. the mammalian hippocampus, and the avian hippocampal formation is important for seed storing and varies among these species and among different comparisons of closely related species as well. So we're going to look in a second at first some comparative studies, like the last one. The last study we had was a comparative study comparing the spatial abilities of birds that store different species that store different numbers of seeds. We're going to look at a few more comparisons, but in this case, is the avian hippocampal formation larger? And turns out it's not always larger. Sometimes it's density of neurons as well. Sometimes it's change in the size of the hippocampal formation during the time of year when spatial memory when storing is occurring. And then manipulative studies as well. What do lesions to these regions do to birds' spatial learning abilities? So this is an example of a comparative study because each square in this figure is another species. And what you hopefully can see is that there are yeah, you do little brain surgery on the birds, and you um, either use a exactly fine pin or another tool to basically separate out the avian hippocampus. So points 1, 2, and 9 are seed storers. Everything else in this figure is a non-storer. Now, what I was hoping to do, that was I should have okay, we're fine. I shouldn't have drawn those. What we have here on the x-axis, we have the body weight on a log scale, right? Because birds can vary a lot. Think 1 gram, 100 grams, a kilogram, right? And those are the logs. And sorry, 10 grams, 100 grams, a kilogram. And then on the y-axis, we have the log hippocampal volume. So if you look, there's a regression line that's been fit to this data. And what does the regression line tell us? So I'm going to just throw that out to chat. It actually doesn't. The R and the R square and the p-value tells you the sort of strength, which would be how close are they on the line. What does the slope tell us? And you might well be thinking what I'm thinking as well. The direction. So interpret the line for me. Yeah, positive correlation. So I'm going to say Mr. Daniel is on the right track. Dimitri knows where I'm going, but that's not what the line tells us. So the line just tells us positive correlation between log body weight and hippocampus volume. Yeah, if you're explaining it to your grandma, you'd say bigger birds have bigger hippocampuses, probably because they have bigger brains. So what's interesting about this graph isn't the line. The line just tells us that bigger birds have bigger hippocampuses, and that probably makes sense because they have bigger heads and bigger brains. What's important in this graph are the distance of each point to the line. And some of you are master's students, and some of you even not have had 230. Can you tell me what these distances between each point and the line are called? Anyone who's had like a stats class? 107, 230. Nope, not standard deviation. Standard deviation is a thing that exists, but that's not what the lines are telling us. There's a special word, not variance, which is kind of like the standard deviation squared, and it's not variance. I greatly appreciate people giving it a shot. I want one more try. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Linear regression. Nope. Nope. However, there is something in that. Um, it starts with an R, and it's not regression. Okay, the magic word I was looking for is residual. So, not errors. So these lines, the differences between each point and a line of fit is called, it's not R squared. R square, so like it's beyond the course. R square is how much of the data is explained, and residuals are important for calculating R square, because if R square was 1, every point would fall on the line. And if R square gets lower and lower, the points will be farther and farther from the line. But let me actually define and write the definition of residual here on the screen. Wow! Okay. Residual, the distance of a point from the regression line or curve, right? And so the residuals are, I'll make it plural, are the distances of all the points from the regression line or curve. So what can you tell me about the residuals of storers versus non-storers? Higher. So the residuals of the storers tend to be positive, right? The, the storers, there are only 3 of them, but they all sit above the line. They're positive. Positive residual, positive residual. 9 and 3 have little positive residuals too, but 5, 6, 7, 8, and 4 and 1 all have negative residuals. And that difference is significant. So what the residuals are saying is that the storing birds have larger hippocampuses than you would predict from their body size, while the non-storing birds have smaller hippocampuses than you would predict from their body size. The negative residuals are smaller, but there's also a lot more of them. So like the sum of the residuals always are going to add up to 0. That's kind of by the definition of like a regression fit line. So say it again. The in ways you would say it from your grandma to your grandma. Birds that store seeds have bigger hippocampuses than you would predict from their body size. That's how you would say it. The way you would say it as a scientist, it would be storing birds have positive residuals, non-storing birds have negative residuals. Storing birds fall over the line of regression most of the time, all the time in this, but it's a small sample. Non-storing birds tend to fall below the regression line. Cool. So this is a really nice study. That's why we're looking at it, even though it's from 1989. These are some really great comparisons as well. Brown-headed cowbirds, behavior gold, they, for many reasons, they are brood parasites, which means that they lay their eggs in other species' nests. They don't raise their own chicks. They depend on other birds, and then the chicks have all these behavioral adaptations. They hatch especially quickly. They push the eggs out of the nest. They're actually sort of bullies and jerks. However, in order for the brown-headed cowbirds to, succeed, they have to lay their egg in the other bird's nest at exactly the right time, right? Because if they lay too early, the other bird can recognize it's a strange egg, and they're more likely to chuck it out or abandon the nest. If they lay it too late, the host eggs will hatch before the parasite, and the parasite won't be able to push them around. So what they want to do is they want to keep track of a whole bunch of nests from a whole bunch of different species within their home range. And as soon as that one over there starts laying, they will lay an egg in that bird's nest. And then when this one over somewhere else starts laying, they'll lay an egg. So it's a tremendous spatial memory challenge to be able to know, keep track of all these different nests in your territory. And females have to do that because they're laying eggs. The males don't, because all the males have to do is sing and try to attract a brown-headed cowbird female to mate with them. They don't need to have great spatial memories. And in this graph, in the comparison, the hippocampal volume of female but not male brown-headed cowbirds is larger than other icterids, other blackbirds that are closely related to them that don't do brood parasitism at all. Red-winged blackbirds, you know, they might dump an egg in another red-winged blackbird's nest, but they're not, in general, they're rearing their own young in their own nests, same for grackles. So there's two comparisons, brown-headed cowbirds and non-brood parasites. Hippocampus is bigger in the brood parasite, and female versus male brown-headed cowbirds, because it's only the females that have to do that spatial learning task in the wild. I seem to have taken out the slide, but when you if you look at chickadees, the hippocampus grows rapidly in chickadees that, so this is not a lesion study, it's kind of nice. It's a brain slicing study, so in the end, everyone meets a horrible demise. But if you section the hippocampus of chicks, you know, when they're younger and older, the hippocampus goes through a growth spurt as their spatial learning abilities improve. If you feed the birds powdered seeds so that they can't practice storing, their hippocampus doesn't grow during that time period. But if you give them seeds to store in their aviary, their hippocampus does grow rapidly during the same time. So it was kind of a nice study, but for some reason I didn't include the slide. Evolutionary psychologists focus on tend to focus on a bunch of abilities that they think are especially sort of hardwired or are easy to study. No, unless in my copious free time I track that slide down and throw it up at a later time, but that's unlikely. Cheater detection, mate choice, homicide, and food choice. And the evolutionary psychologists primarily are studying humans. So all of these are examples that have been studied in humans. What do we mean by cheater detection? So let's say I give you a rule, and the rule in this case is if a person goes to Boston, they take the subway. So it's just like a logical statement. And then each card has either a city or a mode of transportation on it. I want you to take like half a minute and figure out which cards do you have to check to determine that the rule above is being followed. So I'm going to throw up a poll for us to vote, and you can do obviously more than one. I'm not sure if the polling in this allows more than one choice, which saddens me because there can be more than one choice. So yeah, if you've seen this before, that's nice. I think it might only be allowing one choice, which saddens me because that That's not really right. Um, so it should be, the slide should still be visible. The rule is if a person goes to Boston, they take the subway. And the question is, um, if you're presented with a bunch of cards facing up, and on one side is going to be a location, and on the other side of each card is a mode of transportation. So some of them have locations, some of them have modes of transportation. Which ones? Yeah, so that saddens me, because it turns out there's more than one choice. Okay, so what's kind of cool is that people are smart, and the two choices that are most popular, um, were in fact the two that you have to check. Let's go through these choices for a second. Um, if a person goes to Boston, they take the subway. So if you see a Boston, the other side has to be subway for the rule to be followed. So you have to check the Boston card. If a person's not going to Boston, they could take the subway or not take the subway. It's not gonna, the rule doesn't make any prediction. So you don't have to check the back of it because no matter what's on the other side, or they could, yeah, it doesn't matter. Subway, if a person goes to Boston, they take the subway. Um, but if someone is not going to Boston, they could still take the subway. So you don't have to check subway. Um, you don't have to check subway. If cab, well, if the flip side of the card says Boston, they're breaking the rule. If the flip side of the cab card says um, another city, then that doesn't break the rule. I mean, sorry, if the flip side says Boston, they're breaking the rule. So you have to check. So actually, we had you guys chose Boston and Subway, and actually, Boston is correct. Subway is wrong. You need to check cab. Because if you flip cab and there's Boston on the back of cab, they've broken the rule. If you flip subway um, and there's Boston, then the rule is being obeyed. But if you flip subway and it's New York, there's nothing in the rule that says someone that's not from Boston can't still take the subway. Cool. So that was neat. Um, we had a little problem with that. Um, the interesting thing is that you will probably have a much better time with the next challenge. So in this case, the rule is you have to be 21 years old to drink. Which cards do you have to check to determine if the rule is being followed? And I don't think I have to do a poll or anything. It's obvious that 25-year-olds can drink anything, so who cares about them? Anyone can drink Pepsi, so who cares about them? You have to check beer to make sure that the person, the flip side is over 21, and you have to check the 18-year-old to make sure that the flip side isn't beer. So it's the exact same logical question, but when it's phrased in the context of, detecting cheaters, which is hypothesized and is probably a really important, task that social organisms like primates and humans um, needed to deal with. You have to know if people are trustworthy, and actually we're quite bad at that. Um, right. So if you chose the whole thing is it's not so much choosing, it's choosing which ones have to be checked. So if you flip beer and the age is above 21, the rule is being followed. If you flip beer and the age was, 19, 18, 16, then the rule is being broken. 25, you don't have to flip that card because a 25-year-old can drink anything. Pepsi, you don't have to flip the card because any age will still be consistent with the rule. 18, you have to flip, because if 18 is drinking beer, the rule is broken. If 18 is drinking, Pepsi, the rule is not. Cool. So when you give people these challenges, they have a much easier time with the drinking age problem than with the um, transportation problem that doesn't, or another similar problem that doesn't involve dishonesty or cheating, or things that we um, associate with honesty. And this has been taken as evidence that we have sort of mental modules that are dedicated to detecting honesty and deceit, that are not like universal logical tools. So this is also, there are a number of other problems that sort of brain teasers that can show how poor we are, um, unless we're either exceptionally good, and usually that's also because we've had a great deal of practice at um, logical problems. Like, humans are very irrational, and that gets demonstrated in a number of ways. So the assumptions of evolutionary psych include that there was a single environment of evolutionary adaptedness, right? That there was a time when we were well adapted, and those adaptations were somewhat fixed. So originally it was hypothesized as Pleistocene savanna. Now it's described as a composite of many past environments, because the archaeological evidence that humans have lived in very different environments for a very long time is really, really um, unassailable. Um, the other um, assumption of evolutionary psych is gradualism, basically that traits are largely fixed or evolve much too slowly compared to the changes that we've experienced over the last 10,000 years, um, due to rise of cities and agriculture. And then this has been sort of developed more by Cosmides and Tooby to say that, so since behaviors are caused by many, many traits working together, these are co-adapted gene complexes that are hard for selection to change. Population geneticists probably argue against that, and also interestingly, the number of genes in the human genome is now understood to be a lot smaller than we used to think. However, it is true that most traits are, highly depend a lot on epistasis, the interactions of many, many genes. So I buy that behaviors are caused by many, many genes, not necessarily that makes them particularly hard to evolve. The other assumptions of evolutionary psych include this idea of massive modularity, the idea that rather than having general cognitive abilities, general learning abilities, we have highly specific modules that have evolved to do different tasks. So each specific task has its own adaptive psychological mechanism that is evolutionarily fixed. Now, we do see lots of different kinds of like learning and memory tasks that we are pre-adapted for. Probably the best one is language. Humans learn language without being explicitly taught, and we're highly motivated to learn to learn words and learn different sort of grammatical constructions when we're young. That's not to say that enrichment doesn't have a huge effect on language learning, but we also are definitely primed, adapted to learn language. But evolutionary psychologists think that kind of every specific task or problem that we have to solve has kind of a specific hardwired module. So like, mate choice and food choice and many different sort of sets of behavior. And then the sort of combination of gradualism and a single environment to which we used to be adapted leads to assertions of a universal human nature, right? So the idea is that those Pleistocene adaptations are shared among all human groups. Um, it's interesting, though, because many features that evolutionary psychologists often treat as sort of fundamental or immutable, like mating systems, vary widely now and presumably varied widely in the past as well. Um, I mean, oh, that's going to be delightful if it keeps going. I'm sure you can all hear that. Um, while there's great evidence that humans vary very little genetically, that we underwent a population bottleneck about 50,000 years ago, the effective population size at that time is estimated to have been 12,000. What evolutionary psych, sort of elides over is that, um, many of our behaviors are not um, uh, genetically determined and hardwired, and cultural differences might account for the variation in human behaviors that we see now. Anyway, um, so evolutionary psychologists, like I said, really into cheater detection, mate choice, food choice, um, and I forget what the fourth one was. Con. Um, in terms of mate choice and human sexual selection, there's this idea of Bateman's principle and mating systems. Bateman's principle argues that whatever sex has higher variation in reproductive success, or and um, a correlation between mating success and reproductive success, will be subject to stronger sexual selection. In other words, we'll have more traits that are selected to lead um, to more mating attempts. The Bateman studied fruit flies, and the idea is that since females are limited by egg production, individual eggs are costly to produce, and can be fertilized by mating with fewer males, with a few males, like one or two, for insurance, that females are limited more by their ability to make eggs, um, whereas males that can produce much larger numbers of smaller sperm are more limited by their ability to mate with multiple females. Um, and there are many sort of repeatable experiments showing that males benefit more from multiple mating than females. Interestingly, um, part of the reason for that difference in uh, how much they benefit from multiple mating is that males, since females usually mate with more than one male, there's competition among the sperm of different male fruit flies, and fruit flies in particular among insects. I mean, there are many other insects that have this relationship probably, but it's a small fraction. Um, the chemicals that males include with the sperm to try to kill other males' sperm, competitor sperm, are toxic to females. And so actually the more times that female fruit flies mate, the shorter their lifespan is. That's not seen in a lot of other animals, but in fruit flies it's like an especially strong effect. So a few people have studied the degree to which Bateman's principle sort of extends to humans, and evolutionary psychologists like Leo Buss are and Randy Thornhill are exuberantly enthusiastic about this hypothesis because it sort of fits stereotypical gender roles. Um, so people have studied how much does how whether there's a difference in the variability of mating success, of reproductive success, how much does that differ between males and females? And what, you know, a number of studies, this is a review from 2009, I think, showed that in some human societies, um, more likely polygynous um, or serially monogamous societies, um, the ratio of male to female variability in mating success is higher than 1. However, in lots of other societies with not all monogamous, but more often monogamous, um, the variability in male reproductive success versus female reproductive success is about the same. It's pretty close to 1. Um, and so different people take different conclusions from this, from these reviews. Some take them to argue that humans are males are expected to be more affected by sort of sexually selected traits. Sexual selection is expected to act more on males than females. And then others point to other studies where there's no reason to expect um, stronger selection for acquiring more mates in males versus females. This is a review. This is also a review by Brown and al. It's taking that table, and what it's showing is in monogamous cultures, the ratio of male to female variability in reproductive success um, is equal. It's close to 1. However, in serially monogamous cultures and polygynous cultures, um, the ratio is, significantly greater than 1. Um, okay. Um, Another assumption of um, evolutionary psych is this idea of modular attention intelligences, and it's interesting because it's quite controversial, um, and it's a somewhat active research program now. There's a lot less emphasis on it now than in the 1980s. Um, the um, and you see it in sort of the pop psych literature when some people like to identify many, many, many different kinds of intelligences, and others um, are more in favor of sort of a generalized cognitive ability. Um, and of course, the truth is both somewhat in between, and also your specific intelligences are no doubt highly affected by experience. One of my favorite examples is the example of what's called perfect pitch, which could also be called absolute pitch, which is being able to recognize or produce, um, you know, um, an actual note like high C or middle C, um, and recognize that rather than relative pitch, which is if you hear a note, can you sing or play, a fifth or an eighth above that? Can you make harmony? For practicing musicians, it's cool to have absolute pitch. It's absolutely important to have relative pitch. One of the things that's really interesting is that people from cultures that where absolute pitch changes the meanings of words, like Japanese, are much more likely to have perfect pitch. There are now also consistent differences in the proportion of students like getting music training at a young age, but something that is often seen, like perfect pitch is often seen as like, just a gift. I mean, you look, my children, I have 3 children, one has close to perfect pitch. I mean, exquisite relative pitch, and also some absolute pitch ability. One is musical but doesn't have anything like perfect pitch, and another, cannot hold or follow a tune to save their lives. Um, and what's interesting is that trait is subject to early experience, a very specific cognitive ability. Anyway, modular intelligences, the idea of modular intelligences were pretty fashionable when that was sort of the style of early artificial intelligence software. But now a lot of AI is much more like general process learning, where actually you have a general learning engine that you then, train with, 20,000 pictures of airplanes or people or animals with eyes, and you actually don't know how the associations are being made, but you give it some algorithms for being scoring correct versus incorrect answers, and it can learn different associations. So there's a lot less emphasis in computer programming on modular intelligence, and that sort of has weakened the argument for finding highly rigidly separate behavioral modules in human brains as well. So, of course, I always sort of talk a lot, and it would have been useful for me to just go to the slide that was talking about it. So some of the critiques of modular intelligences are that the environment is underestimated, and that's because shared traits can be due to often ignored shared environments, and also gene environment interactions that greatly amplify tiny genetic differences. In other words, the music example is one where really small differences in music ability can lead to huge differences in this one gets music lessons and this one doesn't, or the music lessons stop when this one isn't getting as much reward. And then, however, if both had gotten music lessons for 10 years, both would be, potentially highly competent at the end of that period. One like really classic example is the example of innate recognition of parents' calls in ducklings. It used to be thought that the ducklings were born with a genetic predisposition to recognize their parents' calls, and in fact, that's not what happens. It's that ducklings in the egg, before they hatch, can hear and learn calls and imprint on them, before they hatch. And so the time spent in the egg is part of the environment, and that happens all the time, underestimating the role of environment. The second argument is that the second critique is just that we now know there are a lot fewer genes than people thought there were in the 80s, and that suggests that general processes are more the norm. Really, what we found is not just that there are fewer genes. I'm going to say this. It's not just fewer genes. We now, the whole field of epigenetics is the main take home of epigenetics is that we understand how lots of traits are caused not by differences in genes, but in how they're expressed. And that expression is often shaped by the environment. Okay. Um, so, um, the as you can see, I was already, talking trash about the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, um, because for a number of reasons. Um, no animal, I mean, the environment has always changed, right? It's impossible to pinpoint a single point in time or even a single ecology to which we're perfectly adapted. So, in other words, anatomically modern humans have been around for, I don't know, 150,000 years, maybe a little more. Um, However, we share a common ancestor with chimps 7 million years ago, and we share a common ancestor, with dogs, whatever, um, probably, I don't know, 60 million years ago. Um, and there's been evolution on traits all the way through. And so it seems arbitrary to say that our traits were perfectly adapted and then fixed at some point, between 150,000 and 10,000 years ago, or between 120,000 years ago, um, and not reflecting variation, selection in very different environments before, um, or since. Um, so one of the one of the interesting things that people learned starting in the 60s, um, when they started doing protein electrophoresis, is that there's a ton of variation out there in nature, right? So no organism is perfectly adapted. There's a ton of variation. Why? There's a ton of variation in a lot of our loci. If natural selection gets rid of the bad versions of genes or favors one over others, natural selection should be getting rid of variation all this time. Why is there so much variation? One of the main answers is that most traits, even adaptive traits, reflect trade-offs, like an advantage in one context that might be costly in another. That's what trade-offs mean. And um, yeah, the environment isn't static, and individuals move and often find themselves in different environments. And so the combination of different environments and trade-offs in adaptive traits keeps lots of genetic variation. But that also means that like change never stops. Organisms are never perfectly adapted to their environment because they have the leftovers from earlier environments, and that means that we shouldn't like fetishize a single Pleistocene environment. Um, so the other arguments against the environment of evolutionary adaptedness is that we do have some cases of fairly rapid evolution, right? On a scale much less than 10,000 years, which is when, we start having agriculture in cities. So within the last 5,000 years, um, the ability to digest milk sugars has evolved multiple times, and we're going to see a bunch of slides about that in a second. There are several loci that appear to have been favored because they reduced mortality to different plagues, bubonic plague, the Black Death in particular. We see traits associated with malaria resistance that are tied to, within the last few centuries, changes in land use, cutting down trees, which has led to changes in climate that made a lot of places better for mosquitoes. And then, oddly enough, dry versus wet earwax appears to be a trait that has been under selection, and no one knows why. So what we do is we kind of project our own biases onto the past. So the traits that we think are fixed in humans now, we make up great, plausible, unproven stories about how they used to be adaptive in the past. It's kind of a fun activity, but it's been a not super successful research program. Um, so let's talk about um, food choice problems, which are something that evolutionary psychologists are very fond of. Um, so there doesn't appear to be any single environment of evolutionary adaptedness. We actually, don't know how Paleolithic and Mesolithic humans lived. I mean, people learn things, but it's like a little snapshot from here, a little snapshot from there. At present, there's tremendous variation among what are called pre-industrial societies um, in the old world and new world in terms of how much meat versus plants are being eaten, right? So if someone argues like you should be eating nothing but meat or a tremendous amount of meat because that's what our Paleolithic ancestors ate, our Paleolithic ancestors, you know, expanded rapidly across the globe and have been eating lots of different things in lots of places and eat different things even in Africa now. So, as an example, um, cultures without bow and arrow technology do a lot more gathering. And bow and arrow technology, you can recognize the arrowheads because those are often stone, is a recent invention. What do I mean by recent? Um, 25,000 to 9,000 years ago in different places. Um, in North America, super recent, like about 2000 before the Common Era, so 4,000 years ago. Um, so that means that what we think of as a meat-heavy Paleolithic diet might actually be a far more recent modification than we know. There are certainly some societies that eat a lot of meat, like the Inuit in the Arctic, although that's an incredibly harsh environment that's probably, highly exceptional. However, um, the Hiwi have a high meat but also tuber diet. We'll be talking about manioc in a second. Henrik is great on that. Um, and then the Kung, on the other side, the main source of calories are nuts. Remember, that's part of the reason why children don't forage in the Kung, because they have to go on these long circuits to collect a large volume of nuts that are too heavy for them to carry, and then you can come home and work on processing them. And the Hadza also somewhat also intermediate. Yeah. What that means is you can't generalize and say there is some diet that represents what we are adapted to. That doesn't mean that our current diet is not killing us, but you don't need to go to a hypothetical Paleolithic era to say we are eating far too much sugar and probably far too many calories. Um, and then extend that kind of logic to sort of all of our behaviors, saying that they're predestined from an early adaptive environment. The case of lactase evolution argues strongly against sort of gradualism and our traits being sort of fixed in time. Cattle being domesticated um, happened multiple times within the last 10,000 years. I mean, it's interesting because we don't actually know what the wild, relative of cattle were before they were domesticated. Um, Shortly after, um, different cultures start keeping cattle, there's no doubt strong selection to be able to use milk as a resource, and the ability to digest milk sugar. Um, so having the lactase enzyme continue into adulthood is a trait that's evolved multiple times. So, and we know some of the genes, um, and it's different genes um, in different human societies. that lead to lactase persistence. So the lactase gene is not found in the fossil remains of Europeans from 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. So that means the ability to develop to digest milk sugars as an adult in European-derived populations, it's a recent trait. And it's evolved rapidly in populations cultivating cattle. And there's a nice correlation between the local climate and temperature and the number of diseases that cattle face. Therefore, the sort of how easy is it to breed to raise cattle, and the ability to digest lactase. So what makes this graph a little bit harder to follow is that there are 2 points that kind of ruin every curve, and that's Siberia and Greenland, because the temperature in Siberia and Greenland is super cold, which means that you can't rear cattle there. And there are no cattle diseases because so there's no cattle diseases because in Siberia and Greenland, because there's no cows. So those points you can probably like ignore, but then however, if you look in the other data points, the warmer it gets, the larger the number of cattle diseases that are found, and so the warmer it gets, the more cattle diseases, and this tends to be the more north. So latitude, equator, far from equator. So the warmer it gets, the more cattle diseases, and the higher the proportion of lactose malabsorption. So what this is basically saying is places where it's hard to raise cattle because the high temperatures are good for diseases, disease spread, are less likely to incorporate cattle into the cultures and are less likely to be able to digest milk sugar. What's really interesting is that the ability to digest lactose has arisen multiple times through different mechanisms. In other words, it's an example of convergent evolution. There are African peoples that can digest milk sugars as adults. There are a lot that can't. There are Europeans that can digest milk sugars, and the genes, and sometimes not even the genes that allow digestion, are different in different populations, which is what tells you that this is a trait that can evolve a bunch of different ways and probably pretty easily, right? So that's kind of cool. In some Somali groups, it's not a genetic change in the humans, it's a change in the microbiome, the gut flora, that the bacteria break down the milk sugars instead of enzymes that are produced by the humans. So that's kind of cool. The other thing is just that there's good archaeological evidence that early humans and even non-Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sapiens, but Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, had more diverse diets than we usually give them credit for. So this is 40,000-year-old Neanderthal fossil calculus, the mineral buildup on teeth, and you can scrape it out just like your dentist does. You can analyze it for pollen grains and their contents. And the food residues from fossil Neanderthal teeth showed cooked and uncooked barley grain residues. So early humans were not just meat eaters, and we shouldn't assume that that they were, although they did not have, 60-ounce sodas or read my mind, um, or what's the thing that is the source of all evil in the world? I won't say it, but Raisin Bran. Startling amount of sugar in Raisin Bran. My daughter and I now play the game. It's like bingo, where we're in the supermarket aisle and we try to see which cereal has the most sugar per serving. Um, it I thought it would make her not want them, but it hasn't yet. Okay, so it's 7:45. You know what I'm gonna do? Um, yeah, it's great, but it has like 20 grams of sugar per serving. It's like worse than Fruit Loops, or it's at least as bad. It's kind of crazy. Um, I'm gonna start the next lecture, and then and then we're gonna take a break, and I'm gonna also divide us into groups so that when we come back from the break, we're gonna read a short article and try to work together to answer a worksheet on the article. Okay, so yeah, what's fascinating with cereals? Like a few years ago that, it became sort of part of the culture that, sugar is not actually good, and the word sugar was taken out of the names of things, just like the word fried got taken out of lots of restaurant names, like it's KFC, it's not Kentucky Fried Chicken. Um, and so Super Sugar Smacks became Sugar Smacks. Super Sugar Crisp became Golden Crisps. Anyway, it's great. Um, okay, so what is culture? Um, it can be defined many ways. I'm going to use Richardson and Boyd, and in Heinrich, he defines it kind of the same way. Culture is information capable of affecting individuals' behavior that they acquired from members of the same species through teaching, imitation, and other forms of social transmission. So culture is not just the same thing as learning, and it's not just the same thing as like learning from experience. It's a specialized kind of learning that often comes from intentional teaching and our sort of innate motivation and biases to imitate. And we'll talk about what some of those biases are that we tend to imitate successful, prestigious members. And so the information includes ideas, knowledge, beliefs, values, skills, and attitudes. So all of those are part of culture. Um, there is widespread cultural variation in animals. It is both like interesting, widespread, and much less rich than human cultural differences. But we're going to spend time on especially like song dialects in birds, and there are a couple like great videos about cultural differences among non-human primates. Um, However, that variability is much greater in humans than in animals. So, for example, we're going to see some examples of like food washing in snow monkeys, and they're great examples of cultural variation in food gathering in chimps and whether or not they harvest termites in the same way. Certain chimp cultures um, eat more meat and others eat less meat, but there's nothing like the variation that you see in um, what kind what kinds of foods are eaten by people in different parts of the world, or the variation that we just saw a few slides ago between like almost completely seal and meat-based diet in Inuit versus nuts in uh, the Kung versus sort of manioc complex processing in the Turkanen. Um, and that's just for food. So there are some great examples of cultural variation in primates. And normally we'll watch these videos in class, but I'm going to say um, watch these guys at home. So I'll just make a note of that. They are totally great. The Sapolsky example, I forget if it's in the reading or not. I think it might not be. It's amazing. There was an epidemic that wiped out the dominant males in one large troop of baboons. I mean, it was actually because it was a food poisoning thing. The dominant males had access to meat, and there was some horrible um, disease in, like some horrible kind of toxic rot in the meat. And so it killed the dominant males. And the culture that emerged after that was much more sort of conciliatory and egalitarian. And the interesting thing is it led to a long term, like over decades, long change in the culture of the baboons. So like males would join the group from other baboon troops, um, basically expecting to have to fight their way or get the crap beaten out of them until they'd established their dominance rank. And in fact, that coalitions of males and females would basically not allow the males to take on the roles that they took in most other baboon populations, and they'd sort of enforced within the group, um, a much more egalitarian culture, which is really cool. And the snow monkeys is just totally fun. It's about hot water bathing, but in the text, you can read about several more snow monkey examples, like the tuber washing um, in populations as well, and how that culturally spread. Okay, so this is just a reminder to watch the video about baboons from Robert Sapolsky. And this is also just the reference that you can also find the paper that it's based on. Okay, so this is from Richardson and Boyd. What are sort of the general hypotheses for variation in behaviors among human groups? And they're often kind of three, right? One is that, and it's usually seen as like sort of nature and nurture. So genetic differences, that would be arguing, and that's seen in that terrible book by Nicholas Wade, Troublesome Inheritance. Um, you know, differences among humans in violence, technology, beliefs, um, uh, selfishness versus altruism, are going to be due to due to differences in genes. And you can see Nicholas Wade wrote a book in 2014 arguing basically that. In contrast, you also have Um, you also have others that argue that differences that we see among different human groups and cultures are due to the environment. And probably the most um, famous example of that recently is think of Jared Diamond, um, right? Who's arguing in Guns, Germs, and Steel, um, who argues that a lot of differences to geography. So, you know, ability to um, develop technologies, um, let's see, lots of other cultural differences, um, domesticate animals, um, are result from um, like ease of long distance trade, climate, um, the basically whether local conditions um, encourage development of long distance ocean travel, um, you know, and there's a lot of really cool stuff in um, in Gun Germs and Steel, just sort of pointing out sort of asymmetries and differences, like when the Europeans in the New World, clashed. Um, a large reason why Europeans were able to colonize the New World and not um, be completely rebuffed is because um, there's an asymmetry in transmission of disease, right? Um, Smallpox that killed, only 20% of Europeans, and many of them got it as children because, um, well, and we'll talk about why in a second, because they got it from their domesticated animals, killed, far larger percentage of Native American populations that had never been exposed to it, and many, many other diseases, such that what would happen is the Europeans would visit an area, and then when they came back 10 years later, because transatlantic journeys were expensive and you didn't actually do it all the time, they'd find local populations decimated by the diseases that had been introduced earlier. And he ties it to the much higher dependence um, on domesticated animals in Europe, which were a reservoir for disease that then the humans in Europe sort of adapted to because they were, living in crowded little farms and catching diseases from chickens and cows and stuff, and ducks and sheep. And then they had this whole toolbox of disease with which to decimate populations that had not domesticated as many animals. And he ties the animal domestication into climatic differences and ice ages and stuff. Um, so that's kind of the environmental argument. Um, a third hypothesis that isn't just nature and nurture is that cultures evolve not genetically and not necessarily in a clear way to deal with um, ecological environmental differences, but cultures evolve in different directions, partly because evolution is not end driven. So the alternative would be cultural diverse structures, beliefs, skills, etc. Okay, so we're going to look at sort of each of these hypotheses. It's really clear that cultural differences in beliefs, shared beliefs, shared knowledge, many abilities, technologies are not hardwired in genes. And some of the strongest pieces of evidence for that are cross-cultural adoptive studies. These are not experiments, randomized experiments. It's just the experience of when we've had um, a large number of of children from one culture either kidnapped or adopted into other cultures. They consistently take on the values and beliefs, and these can be startlingly different values and beliefs of the adoptive culture rather than their own. And this is seen when Koreans were adopted into Western families in the, during the following the Korean War. And it was also seen when Western children were adopted into Native American families following, battles and wars. And what happens is then when those, children then become adults, and sometimes they would be, they're they were, fully immersed and acculturated into the, sort of belief systems of the adoptive cultures. And then the other examples of that cultural differences are not caused by genes are, the cultural differences that we see in, countries that are split, right? Like, so if you look at sort of, if you looked at sort of um, the the cultural differences between North and South Koreans, um, you would not argue as Nicholas Wade does. Can't tell you how horrible a book this is, and that the guy that wrote it used to be the editor of the science section in the Times. It's like, oh my God. Anyway, that different people from different countries have innate tendencies towards democratic or autocratic forms of government. There are also examples from that are mentioned described in Richardson and Boyd, the Nuer and Dinka, who are closely related tribes. It's believed that there used to be one tribe that split, and Yankee and Yeoman farmers. So farmers from, English ancestry versus German ancestry in Illinois, that are, you would, neither of those pairs of groups are genetically diverse, but they have significant differences in sort of how they organize their societies and their beliefs that lead to either differences in the ability to make war or differences in sort of economic success and social cohesion. So the the other thing that's interesting about the Nuer and Dinka and the Yankee and Yeoman farmers are the environments that they live in. And rather than saying anything anymore, what I'd like to do is take a 5-minute break, and I am going to randomly sort us into a bunch of groups in that 5 minutes. And then we're going to take probably about 15-20 minutes to read either an excerpt about the Nuer and Dinka and answer a few questions, or an article about Yankee and Yeoman farmers and answer a few questions. So I'm going to stop here.